talk today, entitled Lincoln's Eulogy, is prompted by the discussion held during the March reunion of the Hudson Political Studies program. We engaged in a sort of policy simulation. To recall, the Hudson program provides its fellows with an introduction to liberal education. Tentatively, I will say that the graduates of the program see that a liberal education is possible, that it is somehow the seeing of its own possibility. Therefore, its pursuit, in a manner of speaking, is the substance of a liberal education. What then is the evidence that we engaged in this pursuit after we leave the intensity of the Hudson program? Let us suppose that during the 6 weeks of the program, we leave our cave, our time, and our community. And if we do not see the sun, the idea of the good, we do see an alternative cave, or perhaps people who saw beyond their own cave. We suspect that Socrates and Plato saw with other eyes than the ones with which we peer out at the stream of our time. Return we must, and return we do, to our own cave. How do we now look at the walls that confine us? The aim of the policy simulation was to ascertain whether we have the wherewithal to make prudent judgments about any time and thereby our own. At this moment, Americans are reevaluating their history. Across the street from the college I teach at, the sitting statue, which was massive, of Roger Turney has disappeared from the State House grounds. He wrote Dred Scott v. Sanford and no doubt contributed to the onset of the American War, Civil War. Perhaps he is not an ambiguous case, and he should lose his seat of honor. Nevertheless, we do not wish to stop reading Turney's Dred Scott opinion, since opinions have a way of returning in disguise. To make judgments about our time, we must be able to make judgments about our history. We need to understand the architecture of our particular cave. We seek the builders of America. This then was our simulation. How should we make judgments about our political ancestors? And what should be the consequences of our judgments about them? We considered three: Abraham Lincoln, Henry Clay, and Thomas Jefferson. In the instance of Lincoln, we could judge him in part by the way in which he judges the other two men. Lincoln makes these judgments in the context of a eulogy he gave upon the death of Henry Clay. First, a little review of 19th century history. I'm not a historian, so this sketch may have inaccuracies. We were interested in 6 related events: the Missouri Compromise, 1820, the annexation of Texas, 1845, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the treaty ending the Mexican War, 1848, the Compromise of 1850, the death of Henry Clay in 1852 and Lincoln's eulogy, also in 1852, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, 1854, and finally the founding of the Republican Party in 1854. Most of these events entail the expansion of the United States or the regulation of slavery in the territories. The United States expanded significantly at 2 times in the 19th century. First, under the Jefferson administration, the United States purchased from France the Louisiana territories. This purchase brought the question of slavery in the territories into the national arena with the attempt of Missouri to join the Union as a slave state. Henry Clay, who was Speaker of the House, fashioned the Missouri Compromise. It admitted Missouri as a slave state, Maine as a free state, but perhaps more importantly, it drew a line from the southern border of Missouri above which slavery was forbidden. As a consequence, the prospect in 1820 was that most of the Louisiana Purchase would be made up of free states. The annexation of Texas by the United States and the lands gained as a result of the Mexican War led to the Compromise of 1850, which again was championed in the Senate by Henry Clay. It drew the current border of Texas within the Union, admitted California as a free state, but also left it to the peoples of the New Mexico and Utah territories to choose whether to permit slavery within the boundaries of the territories, petitioning to join the Union, as states. This compromise destroyed the Whig Party, which did not survive much after the presidential election of 1852 as a national party of consequence. In 1854, Stephen Douglas shepherded the Kansas-Nebraska Act through the Congress. It repealed the Missouri Compromise and made the principle of popular sovereignty applicable in most of the territories not yet states. Douglas is famous for claiming that he did not care whether slavery was voted up or down, so long as the people in the territories did the voting. The Republican Party was founded in the context of the agitation for the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This summary brings us to the eulogy. It was written at a focal point of pre-war America. Henry Clay is dead, and with him the party that wrote the compromises that kept the Union together. The next bill, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, written by a Democrat, opened the remainder of the Louisiana Purchase to slavery, led to bloody Kansas, the strengthening of the Republican Party in the North, and finally to Lincoln's election and the American Civil War. Lincoln's eulogy of Clay reveals the reasoning of the pre-Republican Lincoln. We might say that Lincoln is about to become America's Lincoln, the man who would not flinch from engaging in a civil war. In retrospect, this speech is the eulogy for the Whig Party and the hope for resolving the slave question without armed conflict. The readings for the reunion discussion included the House Divided speech, the eulogy of Henry Clay, Jefferson's letter to John Holmes, and chapter 3 on the state of war in John Locke's second treatise. It did not include the Cooper Union speech, to which I refer in the talk following this introduction. A version of this talk was given at St. John's College in Santa Fe. It is my reading of Lincoln's eulogy of Henry Clay and my interpretation of Lincoln's evaluation of Thomas Jefferson. Friends, Romans, and countrymen, lend me your ears. I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. The evil that men do lives after them. The good is oft interred with their bones. So let it be with Caesar. The noble Brutus hath told you Caesar was ambitious. If it were so, it was a grievous fault, and grievously has Caesar answered it. So begins Mark Antony's rebuttal of Brutus's speech justifying the murder of Julius Caesar. Brutus had claimed that he killed Caesar because he was ambitious. The implied ambition was to end the Roman Republic and to institute a monarchy. This ambition would be achieved by Mark Antony and Octavius Caesar, the nephew of Julius, and the first acknowledged emperor of Rome. Brutus contrasted his own honor to Caesar's ambition. Mark Antony's speech depends upon the simple fact that not all ambition is bad. Indeed, seeking honor is an ambition. Antony concentrates on the good that Caesar had done for Rome and the common citizens, and the goods left by Caesar to the commoners in his will. It is the great irony of the speech that by rehearsing the goods that Caesar did and intended, Antony accomplished the evils that Brutus tried to prevent. By praising the good Caesar did, Antony interred them with Caesar's bones. But the evil that was feared that he might do, destroying the Republic, lived on. Shakespeare emphasizes the power of the eulogy of the dead by making Antony display the wounds inflicted on the corpse of Caesar. We know from Shakespeare's Coriolanus that the ancient way in which a patrician would campaign for the position of consul was to display the wounds he received in battle. Antony could imply that Caesar received these mortal wounds fighting for Rome. He relied upon what Lincoln calls in his first inaugural, the mystic chords of memory. In an early speech, The Perpetuation of Our Political Institutions, 1838, Abraham Lincoln warns against the ambitions of a Caesar under the American conditions of lawlessness. He does not blame ambition, but acknowledges that the ambitions of the founders and the framers had been achieved. Therefore, what was left to the ambitious was merely the destruction of the Republic. Men of great ambition were forced to be Caesars to satisfy their ambitions, and the conditions of lawlessness provided them with the opportunity to achieve what Caesar engendered in Rome. Lincoln argues that the passions that protected the American Republic since the founding had become too attenuated to be depended upon. He recommends to his audience, reason, cold, calculating, unimpassioned reason, must furnish all the material for our future support and defense. Let those materials be molded into general intelligence, sound morality, and in particular, a reverence for the Constitution and laws. Yet at the end of the speech, Lincoln invokes the grave of Washington to move his audience to the defense of the Republic and its laws. He tacitly admits that in 1838, he has not resolved the question of how to perpetuate American political institutions. In the perpetuation speech, Lincoln merely alludes to why there is so much lawlessness. The reason is the slave question. American slavery was older than the Declaration of the Constitution. It violated the principles of the Declaration and forced on the Constitutional Convention a number of compromises. It caused significant portions of the electorate, North and South, to challenge the prudence of the Constitution. Still, Lincoln later, in the Cooper Union speech, 1860, calls upon the authority of the dead framers to support the Republican program with regard to slavery. He claims that the Republicans continue the old policy of our fathers. This is all Republicans ask, all Republicans desire in relation to slavery. As those fathers marked it, so let it be again marked, as an evil, not to be extended, but to be tolerated and protected only because of, and so far as, its actual presence among us makes that toleration and protection a necessity. The Republican program, constructed after the demise of Henry Clay's Whig Party, as Lincoln describes it, has two parts. The first requires the continuous branding of slavery as evil. The second, consequent on the first, demands the restriction of slavery to the region in which it exists. It must not spread. The Cooper Union address concentrates on the immediate political issue separating the Stephen Douglas Democrats and the Republicans, whether Congress has the power to exclude slavery from the federal territories. This is a constitutional question, and accordingly, Lincoln examines whether the framers acted as though Congress had this power. He finds that of the 39 framers, 21 voted in favor of federal restrictions on slavery in the territories, and 2 against, while the other 16 did not act in a way that revealed their opinion one way or another. Hence, a clear majority of the framers acted in a way that showed support for the Republican policy to restrict the extension of slavery in the territories. In the Cooper Union's address, Lincoln did not consider the actions or the opinions of the founders who were independent of the framing, most notably Thomas Jefferson. Yet it was the founders, principally Thomas Jefferson, who initiated the first and more fundamental stage of the Republican program. Slavery is wrong because it violates the unalienable rights of mankind. The man most responsible for legislating the compromises that held the Union together for the generation of Americans following the founders and framers was Henry Clay, the subject of one of 2 eulogies by Lincoln. The first subject of this talk is how Lincoln understood Clay's achievements and failures, especially with regard to persuading the sections of the nations to preserve the Union by compromising on the slave question. To evaluate Clay, Lincoln refers to Jefferson's approach to the problem in 1820. Ironically, it was Jefferson's purchase of the Louisiana territories that ignited the rivalries between the slaveholding and free sections of the country. It was a problem President Jefferson left to the succeeding generation to which Clay belonged. I shall argue that while Lincoln eulogizes Henry Clay, he implicitly criticizes Thomas Jefferson's 1820 views on the extension of slavery to the territories, and on the practical responses to the necessity that the existence of slavery presents to the early American Republic. Even in 1852, Lincoln was willing to contest the foundation and prudence of Jefferson's 1820 policy. somewhat like the speeches in Shakespeare's tragedy of Julius Caesar, in which Brutus, the murderer of Caesar, and Mark Antony, Caesar's political ally, speak to the commoners over the body of Caesar. Lincoln begins his eulogy with a long quotation from a public journal that he claims was opposed to Henry Clay. The journal, I suppose, is akin to Mark Antony and Lincoln to Brutus. But this analogy is imperfect because we cannot judge who was Brutus and who was Mark Antony until we can determine whether Henry Clay was a preserver or corrupter of the American Union. Unlike Brutus for Caesar, the opposing journal has nothing bad to say about Clay. I asked the reference librarian at St. John's College in Santa Fe to find the source of the quotation, and she in turn asked distinguished Lincoln scholars. None knows the source of the quotation, and therefore we cannot know what sort of opponent Lincoln quotes. The quotation praises Clay for coming to the aid of his country in times of trial and generally supporting the cause of freedom worldwide. It does not acknowledge his work at the colonization of freedmen in Africa. And it is praise for this work of Clay that takes up much of Lincoln's praise for Clay in the eulogy. There is much bombast in the quotation from the journal, but few specific achievements for the reader to review, and therefore it provides little guidance in how to evaluate Clay's policies of compromise. We may say that the quotation does not distinguish between the goods that Clay did and the evil. A eulogy adopting the form of this quotation speaks well of Henry Clay by only saying good things about him. But we know from Shakespeare that to speak only the good of dead men whose public careers were a mixture of good and evil may have the consequence of enshrining the evil along with the good. This may not be speaking well of a man if a eulogy must speak truly to speak well and not merely say good words about the dead. We can almost hear Mr. Clay, like Caesar, was a good man who served his republic, but to what effect? Henry Clay made compromises. Perhaps the most famous is the Missouri Compromise of 1820. The North did not wish to allow more slave states into the Union from the Louisiana Purchase, and certainly not Missouri, which is very far north. The House of Representatives, which was dominated by the North, at first rejected the compromise, and Clay, who was Speaker of the House, was able to pass the whole compromise by splitting the legislation into two bills for which he could build different coalitions. Missouri was admitted as a slave state, and Maine as a free state, adding an equal number of slave state and free state senators. A line was drawn at the southern border of Missouri, 36 degrees 10 minutes north latitude, so that slavery was excluded from most of the Louisiana Purchase. Texas was not part of the Louisiana Purchase, and thus it is easy to see in light of American history that any territories added to the Union reopened the slavery question. The admission of Texas and the territories gained through the Mexican-American War required another compromise, Clay's last significant legislative endeavor, and a compromise that Stephen Douglas ushered to the House in 1850. In the context of the special danger that the Missouri Compromise involved, Lincoln acknowledges that the controversy about the expansion of slavery into the Louisiana Purchase was the first nationally divisive question where a geographical line divided the opponents. Lincoln then quotes the famous letter of Thomas Jefferson to John Holmes, 1820, in which Jefferson makes this observation. Lincoln ends the quotation at the point that Jefferson seems to recommend the policy of colonization for the freed slaves, and he explains the necessity under which slavery has placed the Americans. Quote, "In that way, a general emancipation and expatriation could be effected, and gradually and with due sacrifices, I think it might be. But as it is, we have the wolf by the ears, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Justice is in one scale and self-preservation in the other." This position might seem to contradict the proposition of the Declaration of Independence that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But Jefferson ever the Lockean in the letter to Holmes makes a direct allusion to Locke's second treatise, where Locke discusses the state of war. Here's the key paragraph. The state of war is a state of enmity and destruction, and therefore declaring by word or action not a passionate and hasty, but a sedate, settled design upon another man's life, puts him in a state of war with him against whom he has declared such an intention, and so has exposed his life to another's power to be taken away by him or anyone that joins with him in his defense and espouses his quarrel. It being reasonable and just, I should have a right to destroy that which threatens me with destruction. For by a fundamental law of nature, man being to be preserved as much as possible when all cannot be preserved, the safety of the innocent is to be preferred. And one may destroy a man who makes war upon him, or has discovered an enmity to his being, for the same reason that one may kill a wolf or a lion, because such men are not under the ties of common law of reason, have no other rule but that of force and violence, and so may be treated as beasts of prey, those dangerous and noxious creatures that will be sure to destroy him whenever he fall into their power. I grant that the way Locke seems to frame the argument is that the innocent may destroy a man who makes war upon him. Yet Locke later in the sentence actually writes more neutrally or more generally. He says, one may destroy a man who makes war upon him, and then he goes on, or has discovered an enmity to his being. Surely in a Lockean world, the enslaver does not need much imagination to discover that those that he has enslaved have an enmity towards him. At least I claim that the Jefferson of 1820 interpreted Locke in this manner, and perhaps the Jefferson of 1776 did as well. Yet permit me to add that Jefferson does not use this text of Locke to claim that this destruction of the victimized is just, although the paragraph above might suggest this interpretation. Jefferson's interpretation condemns slavery more than this interpretation that the state of war makes even slavery acceptable. Because Americans in 1820, or perhaps in 1776, were not tabula rasa, the crimes against the slaves were long-standing. They had already moved from the state of nature with the enslaved into a state of war. The problem then was how to extract the two populations from a state of war with each other. Thus, according to this interpretation of Locke, the policy advanced in Jefferson's letter under the circumstances of 1820 does not in fact contradict the Declaration of Independence. Slavery is unjust. It violates the unalienable rights that all humans naturally have. But once a people had put these Africans in slavery, they also placed themselves in the state of war with the enslaved. Moreover, because this crime of one people against another is marked by racial distinction, there cannot be peace between the races. This war is a natural necessity founded upon the strongest human passion, the drive for self-preservation. Therefore, the only reasonable policy is colonization for the newly freed population. The two races must be separated territorially. From Jefferson's 1820 vantage, the 13th Amendment is utter folly. This part of the letter Lincoln quotes exactly, and perhaps he agrees with some of the sentiments thereby expressed. Lincoln certainly supports Clay's effort at colonization and pursues this policy at least through the middle of the Civil War. The rest of the letter Lincoln suppresses. In the later section of the letter, Jefferson seems to come out against any compromise, including the Missouri Compromise, that might draw a line between slave and free states, however far south that line might be. Rather, he seems to support the spreading of slavery in order to dilute it. Quote, I am certain that as the passage of slaves from one state to another would not make a slave of a single human being who would not be so without it, so their diffusion over a greater surface would make them individually happier and proportionally facilitate the accomplishment of their emancipation by dividing the burden on a greater number of coadjutors. End of quote. Clearly, Jefferson thinks the spread of slavery to the territories would accomplish two things. First, the likelihood of a civil war between Americans would be greatly diminished because there would be no geographical line drawn between the proponents and the opponents of slavery. Second, the possibility of a race war would be nil, since he thought the slave population would not thereby increase, but only be diluted among a larger free population. Therefore, as the fear of a race war diminishes, the chances of emancipation for the enslaved would be increased. Jefferson does not consider the economic incentives to increase the slave population. Jefferson may have been right in his estimation of these two consequences. Certainly, reasoning from the Lockean principles that he adopts in the letter, Jefferson's policy of 1820 may follow. Slavery can never be safely eradicated by the enslavers unless the slave population is relocated, and rational humans who live in a country with a significant slave population, as in the American South, would never emancipate the slaves without the guarantee that the freed slaves be removed from among the enslaving race. Hence, according to Jefferson, it is rational for American citizens in the South to oppose emancipation, whether or not they are slave owners. It is not chiefly a question of economics, but of self-preservation. At least in this letter, Jefferson does not support the Republican policy of restricting slavery to its current boundaries. His policy is closer to Stephen Douglas's squatter sovereignty, according to which the decision about slavery in the territories should be left to the inhabitants of the territories and not to the federal government. The moral foundation of Douglas' squatter sovereignty is to care not whether slavery be voted up or down. Jefferson, throughout his life, rejects this sentiment. He never disputes that slavery is wrong. Nevertheless, he laments that the blessings of the Union should be thrown away for the sake, quote, of an abstract principle, end of quote. But what is this abstract principle? That slavery should not spread because it is wrong? Any formulation of the principle confining slavery to the South because the spread of it is wrong, Jefferson should concede, would sound dangerously like the principle proclaimed in the Declaration, that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Does the Declaration declare merely an abstract principle? If so, how seriously are they to be followed? Lincoln's policy and that of the Republicans depend upon a continuity between the founders and the framers, a continuity between the Declaration and the Constitution, a continuity between the principle that slavery is wrong and evil and the exclusion of it from the federal territories. By placing Jefferson's quotation in the middle of a eulogy of Henry Clay, Lincoln implicitly recognizes that these continuities are problematic, or at least that the Jefferson of 1820 might easily be interpreted as supporting the policies of Stephen Douglas, Lincoln's chief Northern opponent. Lincoln shows decisively in the Cooper Union Address that the framers pursued a policy of the exclusion of slavery from the territories. In 1820, Jefferson broke from the policy of the framers and criticized the leaders of the Missouri Compromise. He inserted, quote, that the useless sacrifice of themselves by the generation of 1776 to acquire self-government and happiness to their country is to be thrown away by the unwise and unworthy passions of their sons, end of quote. Yet these sons might easily object to Jefferson that the division between the author of the Declaration and the framers left them with no moral, practical guidance in 1820, and again in 1850, with how to deal with the slavery question and preserve the Union. The compromises that Clay fashioned could not rely on principles stated by the founders and the framers. The Declaration and the Constitution stood apart in 1820. The reasoning behind the compromises must remain mute, because the strongest argument for the compromises was that the Union has no convincing unifying reason. This truth could not be said. Lincoln praises Clay's elegance. He asserts that Clay's political speeches employed, quote, that deeply earnest and impassioned tone and manner which can proceed only from great sincerity and a thorough conviction in the speaker of the justice and importance of his case. This it is that truly touches the chords of human sympathy, and those who heard it, Mr. Clay never failed to be moved by it, or ever after forgot the impression. All his efforts were made for practical effect. He never spoke merely to be heard. He never delivered a 4th of July oration or a eulogy on an occasion like this. As a politician or statesman, no one was so habitually careful to avoid all sectional ground. Whatever he did for the whole country. End of quote. Later in the eulogy, Lincoln demonstrates that Henry Clay could be eloquent. But according to Lincoln, Clay never undertook to revisit the Declaration of Independence, even in a 4th of July oration. Perhaps he thought no American could surpass the words and thought Jefferson declared at the momentous occasion at the birth of the Republic. Or perhaps a practical Clay could not reconcile the founding of the nation in the framing of the Constitution. As the eulogy seems to present him, he could never reconcile the universal principles of the Declaration with the particular good of the American people for whom he legislated. He could never bring to his speech, it seems, the conviction that the Union of 1820 and the Declaration were finally compatible. We infer that he thought he had to compromise the universal principles to accommodate the Union devoted in the first place to the good of the particular people living in the United States in 1820, and again in 1850. What Jefferson could not do, Clay would not try. Lincoln praises Clay for acting for the whole country. Clay took its wholeness as merely a political contrivance, and when he saw disunity, he would not recast the grounds of the Union, but only patch the tear with a compromise having no unifying principle. Clay did not know how to make the country whole, and he did not work at it lest he disturb its fragile political union. Clay knew how to act for the crises of 1820 and 1850. Nevertheless, he lacked the proper words for these occasions. Otherwise, the crisis of the Louisiana Purchase would not be repeated again in 1850, with the potential treatment of the territories gained with the admission of Texas and the Mexican War. Clay failed to provide Americans with a reformulation of the Union that maintained that slavery was evil and that confined the extent of this evil. Lincoln chooses not to be very hard on Henry Clay. It is an enduring problem of the American nation how to reconcile the universal principles in the Declaration with the particular good of the American people. Indeed, Lincoln, like Clay, is silent about Jefferson's failure to establish this reconciliation in 1820. Yet Lincoln does indicate Jefferson's failure by indirection through his quotation of the letter to Holmes. Lincoln could not permit that the good of the Declaration be interred with the bones of Jefferson's failed policies. When we judge a statesman, at the least, we need to know, with regard to the circumstances of his era, what is good and what is evil, what is necessary and what is possible, and how necessity and evil, possibility and goodness come together. In his judgment of Jefferson and Clay, Lincoln examines, with respect to slavery, the distinction between what is possible and what is necessary. These reflections arm him for the challenge of slavery in the Civil War in his own career as statesman. Citizens in a republic should understand this distinction, especially about the most divisive issues of our times. And this, I think, is largely what's lacking at the present. Let us test ourselves by a part of the eulogy that many, if not all of you, will find repugnant. Lincoln seems to imply that there is an important instance in which Clay found the voice of principle and inspiration that he lacked in the question of the territorial expansion of slavery. Lincoln approves of the following text by Clay, quote, this is Clay talking, "There is a moral fitness in the idea of returning to Africa her children, whose ancestors have been torn from her by the ruthless hand of fraud and violence. Transplanted in a foreign land, they will carry back to their native soil the rich fruits of religion, civilization, law, and liberty. May it not be one of the great designs of the ruler of the universe, whose ways are often inscrutable by short-sighted mortals, thus to transform an original crime into a signal blessing to that most unfortunate portion of the globe." End of quote. In the context of the discussion of colonization, Clay does not hesitate to brand slavery as a crime. He was, in fact, a president of the American Colonization Society. Henry Clay also had slaves. In all, he generally followed Jefferson's example. He found slavery a crime, but he owned slaves. He did free them upon his death, and he could maintain his position consistently if he followed the Jeffersonian reasoning of 1820. Emancipation is not reasonable without expatriation. It is obvious to us, 170 years after the Eulogy, 150 years after the 13th Amendment, that this proposal by Clay and Lincoln's approval of it heap another burden upon the enslaved and their descendants. Torn from one homeland, they are about to be torn yet again from another. Nevertheless, let us not inter the good with the evil. It is especially important that we try to see clearly when our moral principles are violated. This is the advantage of a liberal education. Thus, we need to inquire, is it possible that this very consideration of employing the former slaves as colonists of Western civilization, was it useful for the advance of the universal principles of the Declaration? To review, Lincoln, like Clay, seems to adopt Jefferson's 1820 view on the subject of emancipation, but there are significant differences. Lincoln did not think that any remedy except gradual emancipation had any chance of implementation, but he was clear-sighted in realizing that it would probably be ineffectual. While Jefferson thinks emancipation of the slaves without expatriation threatened the self-preservation of the slaveholding and free citizens of the southern states, Lincoln puts the cause in less severe terms. Indeed, the problem is the prejudice of the white population. Now, here's a quotation that can be used against Lincoln, but I think it shows his clear-sightedness. Quote, "What then? Free them and make them politically and socially our equals? My own feelings will not admit of this, and if mine would, we well know that those of a great mass of the white people will not. Whether this feeling accords with justice and sound judgment is not the sole question, if indeed it is any part of it. A universal feeling, whether well or ill-founded, cannot be safely disregarded. We cannot then make them our equals." End of quote. The fear for self-preservation is not a feeling that admits of elimination. A fear of distaste for the equality of the races might be moderated. As Lincoln's support for the 13th Amendment indicated, the war made him abandon hopes for gradual emancipation and wholesale expatriation of the former slaves. Mass emancipation required a major alteration in the political center of the mid-18th century America that advocated the emancipation of the slaves. Lincoln prepared a transformation of the Jeffersonian moral and political tradition so that the freed slaves might remain in the United States. Yet he could not institute the gradual modification of the Jeffersonian tradition. He abolished slavery completely and abruptly. We may claim that Jefferson was not a racist, and that Lincoln perhaps was. Jefferson refused to accept the emancipation of slaves because the fundamental human passions would not allow it. The science of justice, adopted by the Declaration, depends upon the unalterable nature of the drive for self-preservation. It is a universal truth, and as a consequence can never be overcome. American slavery put the races in a permanent condition of war. For Lincoln, the antipathy between the races depended primarily upon the feelings of the white race. With some equivocation, he says he joins in this prejudice. But this feeling is particular. It is not natural. Since it may be overcome, the 13th Amendment is not folly. Lincoln is aware that feelings may be educated. Indeed, his civil religion finally is the education of feelings. Silently, he alters the Lockean understanding of Jefferson's Declaration to one closer to Rousseau's. Humans are more malleable than Jefferson thought. We we now do not feel repugnance at interracial marriage. Can anyone doubt Lincoln that this was nearly a universal feeling in 1858? The great advantage of Jefferson's view of the Declaration is its principles are unalterable. All men are created equal. This cannot be changed. The danger of Lincoln's position is that what can be changed for the better can also be changed for the worse. It is not likely that Jefferson thought the American Republic needed a civil religion. The Lockean science of justice is enough. From the time of his early perpetuation speech, Lincoln saw the need for a civil religion. In fact, he develops this civil religion in the second inaugural. Obviously, the cold, reasonable civil religion of reverence for the law is not enough. The failure of the first inaugural to turn the South from the path of civil war demonstrates this inadequacy, at least in 1861. The second inaugural has recourse to Christianity and its scriptures. It calls upon the people, North and South, former slaveholders and former slaves, to have malice towards none and charity for all. Lincoln's genius employs deeply and long-held universal and transcendent beliefs to persuade the Civil War antagonists to move on from their old hatreds. North and South, white and black, can live together in peace and harmony. For Lincoln's vision of national reconciliation, perhaps we may praise Henry Clay. Remember, Henry Clay seemed to lack sympathy for the freed slaves when he advocated colonization. Indeed, he naively thought that colonization might transform the original crime into a blessing for mankind, in Africa in particular. He acknowledges that mortals cannot know the ways of God's providence. Is not a similar providential transformation the hope of the second inaugural? Like Clay, Lincoln speculates that the evil consequences of slavery and the Civil War might be transformed into a new birth of freedom for America and mankind, in which the Christian admonition to have malice towards none and charity for all will find its achievement. The great statesmen sometimes know how to transform a necessary evil into a possible good. Does Lincoln owe this thought to Henry Clay? Did Henry Clay provide the inspiration for Lincoln's civil religion? Lincoln eulogizes Henry Clay, and he eulogizes Thomas Jefferson. Lincoln understands what was possible and what was necessary in the time of the crisis of 1820 better than we do hundreds of years later. Sometimes, perhaps, a rare individual, a Shakespeare, may grasp the past more fully than its ancient statesman. And Lincoln learned from Shakespeare. Today, I eulogize Lincoln. Did he turn the prejudice of the white citizens, a prejudice that he knew to be unjust, to some good? I believe so. By focusing on prejudice rather than on self-preservation, he made general emancipation thinkable and therefore possible. He prepared the feelings of the Americans for the possibility of the transformation in racial relations. Today we talk about racism as something subtle, sometimes unconscious, sometimes embedded in habitual and apparently ordinary behavior. Does any reader of William Faulkner think racism was subtle 75 years ago? In my view, the American nation today is extremely divided. Do we try to hear the arguments of our opponents, or are they consigned to the category of the damned, and damn fools at that? Do we have any notion how to take our shared principles and employ them to cross divisions? We talk today mostly of hatred between opponents. In a parody of Christianity, we link hatred in the word, hate speech. Does anyone care about using the mystic chords of memory to resolve the divisions in the Republic? I eulogize Lincoln. He knew the strengths of the American principles and the American people. He knew their prejudices as prejudices, even when he shared them. His example shows the continuing need in the American Republic for true statesmanship. He worked to minimize the evils given to the Republic by necessity. He tried to make our universal principles prevail over our parochial interests. He worked to make the United States the last great hope of a suffering humanity. He thought, as we all should hope, that human suffering can be ameliorated by free women and men, and if we are liberally educated, by us. Thanks for listening.